Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of Riskologists. As always, I'm your host, Pat Bradshaw, and today absolutely delighted to be joined by Dan Patterson. So Dan, thanks very much for coming on.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. I'm excited to spend some time with you today. So this is going to be good.
Excellent. At this point, I'd normally ask what your podcast game is like, but I've already had the pleasure of listening to a couple of things that you've been involved in previously, so I don't think you should be too far out your comfort zone. Well, like I said, Dan, as I always do in these episodes, I think a really good place to start is a bit of a journey to date, really. So I guess how you've got into risk management as a career and project management, a little bit of a timeline of your career, some highlights up to what you're doing today as we speak. So yeah, fire away.
All right, my goodness, Pat. So where do I start? Well, let's start in sequential order. So this is a little bit random, but ever since I've been a young child, I've always had a pet peeve for being late.
Oh wow!
So so I think my professional career in scheduling and forecasting stems from literally just this hatred for anything late. I spent way too many years at University of Nottingham as both undergrad and postgrad, and almost by chance, off the back of that experience, I was working for an engineering company in Northern England in my early 20s, and I had what I thought was a really exciting, interesting concept for building a planning software product. So I went to my boss and did an informal pitch and said, "Hey, I really think we should build this thing." And it's so funny, Pat. I remember it to this day. He turned around and said, "Well, what if it doesn't work?" And I was I was young, I was energetic, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, well, what if it does work?" So I wrote a white paper, submitted it to a conference in the United States, and presented the white paper, and actually got headhunted at that conference in the mid 1990s.
Wow.
So literally quit my job in the UK, had one suitcase to my name, jumped on a plane, and emigrated to Houston, Texas, of all places, in the mid 90s. So that was really the start of my sort of branching off on my own. And then following that, gosh, I mean, I've spent the last 20 years building organizations. I founded 3 software companies, very specifically in the project scheduling and project planning space. The first of those 3 companies focused on risk, which was interesting, Pat, because at the time, risk management, risk analysis was in its sort of early form with regards to commercial software products. So, in many ways, we spent more time evangelizing and trying to demystify the science of risk management than we did actually building software.
Yeah.
But that was really exciting, and I think some great things came of that. Accelerate 20 years forward, and it's almost the exception these days for a project not to undertake some form of risk analysis. So that then led me to my second organization, which was called Acumen. And Acumen was while it was tied to risk analysis, was really more looking at the quality of project schedules. So think of it as taking your schedule to the doctor, and the doctor would critique the health of the schedule. And again, that was a really interesting journey for me, because it absolutely, without a doubt, made a huge impact on our industry in terms of helping scheduling. But just from a personal journey perspective, what I learned from that was, if you build a tool that effectively critiques something or someone, generally as humans, we don't like being told that we're not perfect. And so commercially in the early days, that product was actually a bit of a flop, because the software would come back and lots of red lights, and it would ding you and tell you how terrible you were. So I learned something very valuable during those times, in that you can still critique and validate something, but if you combine those critiques into, for example, a score, then again, I think as humans, we actually start to, we're naturally competitive. We want to improve on our goodness and our scores. And so we developed a concept called the schedule index, which was a 0 to 100% score on the quality of schedules.
Yeah.
And that was massively valuable. And again, I think it was a really good life lesson for me. And then more recently, again, very much within the science of project scheduling and improving the discipline of project scheduling, I founded an organization called Basis. And Basis was very simple in that it would take historical prior project information. So it would take Microsoft Project, Primavera schedules, and it would store them in a knowledge library. And then we developed an AI, what we call an inference engine, that would go off and mine that historical information and come back and make suggestions to planners and schedulers when building new plans. And well, wow, you say wow, Pat, that was another interesting journey, because it was absolutely, from a sort of a mathematical and a software perspective, it was fantastic. It was very, very clever. But again, from a human adoption perspective, it was more bleeding edge than cutting edge. And in some ways, I think it was a little bit before its time. And so, I think looking back, while it was a very valuable and still is a very valuable tool, the concept of making humans comfortable, as computing power gets more and more powerful, and whether it's AI or other emerging techniques, I think it's really important, as we continue to build solutions, that we ensure that humans are comfortable. At the end of the day, planners, schedulers, cost estimators, risk analysts, they're all experts in their domain, and really a computer should assist with that expertise and not challenge that expertise, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense, yeah.
So that was sort of a convoluted walkthrough of my journey to date over the last 20 plus years in the project controls, project planning, risk analysis space.
Yeah.
And I'm still in the thick of it today, and we'll probably get into that later on in this session, I'm guessing.
We certainly will. Yeah, sorry, Dan, I forgot to mention earlier, we've only had a couple of guests that aren't on GMT time zone. I think we've had someone from Canada, and we had a guest over in the UAE as well. So I think you're our first guest over in the States. It's Scottsdale, Arizona, wonderful. You're in now, isn't it?
Correct. Yes. So yes. Well, amazingly hot in the summer, and just very hot in the winter is probably the best way to describe Scottsdale. It's hot all the time in this place.
Yeah, I'm still yet to get my wings over in the US. I've done quite a fair bit of traveling, but the US is one place I've not been yet. But me and my girlfriend are hoping to travel over to the West Coast at some point, hopefully this year, depending on what happens in the world. But yeah, in case, people probably won't be aware, Dan and I met at Project Controls Expo, just gone recently. I think it was November time, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. It was
in London, 2021, and we spoke, albeit briefly, about the podcast, and yeah, here we are today. So
I know that conference was great, because it was the first time in 2 years that we'd all interacted and got back together in person again. So that was exactly. a real milestone conference.
Exactly. Yeah, I know, it was a pleasure. But yeah, thanks so much for that walkthrough, Dan. As everybody can hear, you've had a brilliant and an illustrious career, and I think for me, what's really I don't think striking is the right word, but especially from listening to your other podcasts, it's really palpable how passionate you are about project management and how it's and how much it means to you. So I guess from my perspective, what has been your underlying motivation and vision throughout your career, and obviously the development of these softwares, different software over the years?
Yeah, really good question, Pat. So, here we are in 2022, and again, almost without exception, every major capital investment project overruns, both with regards to time and also budget or cost.
Yeah.
And everybody still blames poor execution. Well, construction overran, or commissioning took longer than planned. And honestly, I've always had the very strong belief that, if you call those overruns, if you think of those as project failure really isn't due to poor execution. Execution is what it is.
Yeah.
There's a perception that execution has overrun because we're comparing that execution to something. And normally we compare what we're actually doing with a plan or a forecast. Well, if our forecast is overly aggressive, overly optimistic, doesn't account for external factors, and I know we're going to get into risk in a lot more detail, then at the end of the day, it's not poor execution, it's poor planning. So I've always had the very passionate belief that as an industry, we need to do a better job of more accurately planning, forecasting, making those plans more achievable. It's okay to account for the bad stuff during planning. Again, I look at a Microsoft project or a Primavera schedule. Most scheduling tools are based on a 50-year-old method called CPM, or critical path methodology. A CPM schedule will only be achieved if every single activity in that schedule isn't late. In other words, is executed on time.
Yeah.
Well, that's ridiculous. The chance of not having knock-on effect, even through an A goes to B goes to C, is very, very low. So imagine a schedule with hundreds of thousand activities. You haven't got a hope in hell of actually coming in on time. Conversely, if we start to account for and embed some of the bad stuff, external risk events, perhaps scope isn't fully defined, things like that, then we start to move into a world where we're actually forecasting a more achievable, a more realistic plan. And I think, really that's where risk analysis, risk-adjusted schedules, risk-adjusted cost estimates have played an important role, again, because they start to take into account, you could call it the bad stuff, I would call it the realistic stuff that most likely is going to happen during execution. So I think for me, it's anything we can do to improve the science of forecasting and planning is a very good thing. And honestly, that's been my motivation, and I get super excited about it.
Well, it's amazing. I could tell, Dan, and I think in my early tenure in risk management, I must sound like a broken record. I say this every podcast, but just coming up to 18 months, and it was only sort of in starting to do the podcast and having these sort of conversations with people that I realised in what dire straits the statistics were in terms of successful projects and delivered on time and to budget. And like I say, we'll get more into the detail in this episode as well. But it's interesting to see that there's more things at play than just prima facie poor planning and stuff like that. So yeah, no, I'm sure we'll dive into that shortly. But as everyone will have seen from the title of the episode, so today we'll be chatting about the evolution of project risk assessment techniques over the past 10 years and what's next, really. So I think it's fair to say there aren't many better qualified people that I could get stuck into this topic with. So in simple terms, Dan, just to kick us off, and I suppose get the ball rolling, please could you define for us risk management in the context of CapEx projects?
Okay, so don't hang up on me, but I'm actually going to say no, because I think risk management should have been coined confidence management. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, whether it's, if it's something as simple as just identifying risks, and we put them in Excel and we call it a risk register, or at the other end of the spectrum, we're doing some fancy advanced Monte Carlo simulation with correlation and all sorts of bells and whistles. Irrespective of the approach we're using, we're ultimately trying to increase our confidence in this thing called a forecast. And so, for me, I think risk management is really more about confidence management. And I think it's trying to help defend the cost and schedule forecast that we as a project, whether we're the owner organization or the contractor responsible for actually doing the work, we're trying to bring confidence and certainty to the table in that forecast. So, if I get off my high horse beyond the sort of risk versus confidence management thing, I think, confidence or risk management really, it's a two-pronged attack. I think step one is, first of all, you've got to identify your exposure. And again, whether that's an advanced quantitative analysis or a more simplistic, just qualitative identification, both are okay.
Yeah.
So, step one is figuring out what your exposure is. I think more importantly, though, step two is then deciding or determining what the heck to do about that exposure. When I facilitate a risk workshop and we do our fancy modeling and we come back with, okay, your 24-month project, is most likely to take 36 months. My question, I sort of ask a rhetorical question and say, well, so what? Well, the so what is if 36 months is okay, then you don't need to respond to that risk exposure. So really for me, it's all about proactively determining, okay, if our risk adjusted forecast is X, then what are we willing to invest and spend in terms of risk reduction and risk mitigation in order to achieve a shorter, often cheaper forecast, if that makes sense. So I think it's identification, which is important, and quantification, but then more importantly, it's all about proactively determining what the heck to do about that risk exposure. And in some cases, Pat, it's interesting, I've worked on many projects where the cost of mitigating risk simply isn't worth it. And I find that very, very fascinating, actually, to the point where in some instances, we've modeled scenarios where the best way to reduce schedule overrun, and you're going to think I'm crazy here, but the best way to reduce schedule overrun is actually to delay some aspects of the schedule so that you introduce float into sequential segments rather than butting everything up and trying to do as early as possible. Introducing float into a schedule, I think, is very, very important. And again, I always try and break things into sort of, I call them baby chunks, right? And for me, I think of a schedule comprising, or a forecast is a schedule with multiple paths leading to the finish, and some paths carry float. And typically, float is your friend because float is, in non-technical terms, it's something that you can consume without impacting the rest of the project. Now, how does that relate to risk? Well, risk eats float. So risk consumes float. Okay, well, if risk consumes float, then this concept of contingency, which is your risk reduction, contingency absorbs risk. So you've got contingency, which is mopping up risk, which is a good thing, and then risk is consuming float, which is a bad thing. And it's all about balancing the two. There's no point having an incredibly expensive, onerous contingency plan if the risk isn't actually eating sufficient float to make you late. So it's all about the balance between risk and float.
No, that's fascinating, Dan. I think in the recent months, I've really been dialing in on my skills in sort of quantitative risk analysis and the software and stuff like that. So especially in terms of like planning and project fundamentals as well. So I think 6 months ago, I probably would have been a bit lost in this conversation, but it's for my own learning as well. I think it's really refreshing for me that I'd sort of really understand the points that you're making, and I think they're really quite poignant as well. Another thing that I picked up on is that you said that you like to refer to baby chunks. My
chunks,
yeah. My mentor Paul Sutcliffe, he always refers to things in bite-sized chunks as well. I think it's something that's quite common that I've spoken to people on the podcast.
It's interesting, Pat. Again, in the early years when we were developing risk software, we would get input and advice from these so-called highly intellectual risk consultants, and what I realized over the years was people don't like complicated. They like simple. We use a device today, a chunk of silicon that used to be called a phone, that doesn't even have any buttons. I mean, who would have thought a telephone without buttons? And it's great. It's so simple. And again, I think as an industry, we're getting better at simplifying complex. As a risk analyst, I shouldn't have to read a user manual or look up in a help file in order to be able to drive a piece of risk software. So the more that we can do to make these tools not just more appealing but more usable by the masses, I think is a very good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of my concerns when I first sort of saw these these products and this software and stuff, I'd sort of see it in the first instance. And I've my own admission, I've said in previous podcasts, I've never really been a numbers guy. It's never been my strength. However, I found the usability of these products, and I did think that products 10 years ago might have been a little bit simpler to use just because technology has evolved, but I think it's gone the opposite way. Well, obviously I wasn't in risk 10 years ago. I was 17. I was 17 10 years ago. But I think it's a testament to the software and the products. If a layman or if I can understand it pretty soon off the bat, then I think that can only be a good thing.
It's funny, Pat. When I look at some of the early tools we developed, in order for the software to do its analysis, we would ask the end user for things like 3-point estimates. Is it a triangular distribution or a uniform distribution? We would ask about correlation. We would expose the user to things like merge bias and central limit theorem. And looking back now, I cringe, because a project controls team member doesn't give a hoot about any of that. The project controls team member wants to understand how to better their project. And so, you can protect the audience from all of that complexity. Behind the scenes, the computer still needs to take into account all of those things. But, making these project controls software packages relevant to the end user, for me, is something that, again, I'm really focused on. And if anyone starts off a product demo to me these days, touting how clever and complicated it is, I normally switch off very, very quickly because they've got it completely backwards.
No, I completely agree. I think there's all these, like you say, all these scary words like correlation and kurtosis and all this central limit theorem when I was first sitting down and learning the foundations of it. And like I said, the partners at Optimizer said, "Oh, it's a fancy word for this, or it's a fancy word for this." And you're like, "All right,
it's a fancy word for stuff in a hierarchy canceling each other out."
Exactly. And then it sort of begged the question. I was like, does anybody actually use these words, like, other than when it's on the screen in front of you, and if you might be trying to look a bit clever or something? Like, if you're delivering this information high level to somebody who wants to know X, Y, and Z, then what is the point? And I think it's a really good point, Dan, that we don't like complicated. And as just to reiterate, I think the fact that I was able to sort of get my head around it quite quickly is a bit of a testament to how far it's come.
Yep.
Excellent. So as we've touched on, Dan, I think obviously many of your products have been and are being used around the world. What do you think has been their biggest impact? I know we've probably touched on a couple of things there in terms of simplifying things and prioritizing the end user, but is there anything else that springs to mind?
Yeah, so without sort of sounding repetitive, because I think we just spent the last few minutes, emphasizing this concept of making complex simple. Really, I think probably the biggest impact beyond literally improving our ability to forecast has been the fact that we've opened up the science of scheduling and sort of demystified it, I think, in many ways, and tied to that. Today, when an organization develops a schedule or a forecast, there is a lot more emphasis around due diligence, making sure that it's structurally sound. Have we done our risk analysis? Have we gained consensus from the project team? Again, in the old days, it used to be a planner or scheduler sitting in isolation and planning in sort of what I call a silo environment.
Yeah,
I think quite simply just the fact that there's multiple checks and balances now and more collaboration on building that forecast is probably the biggest benefit.
Amazing. And so leading on from that, Dan, in all your years of delivering this risk software, what would you say have been your biggest lessons that you've learned, and where, if at all, any of the products have fallen short?
Oh, I don't want to talk about where the products have fallen short.
That's why I did if at all.
All right. So I think it's very important. And again, you're going to think I sound very simple, but I think just believing in what you believe is really key. Don't be swayed by I shared with you my experience as a young 20-something when my boss said, well, what if it doesn't work? Well, don't worry about that. Put your efforts into further ensuring that a concept will work. I think commercially, don't worry about the competition. Again, I think a lot of organizations spend way too much time looking around, worrying what others are doing. If you believe in what it is you're building and you believe in the value that people are getting out of your product, then that's very healthy. Don't spend your time trying to either catch up with or just worry about the competition. That's not very useful. And then this is getting a bit more into sort of the weeds of building products and solutions. And you may laugh at this one, but default to no. So what I mean by that is, as you're building a widget, a software product, a piece of hardware, typically you're going to get lots of ideas and input from people. And I think it's important to be careful that you don't say yes to everybody. Otherwise, you don't really you don't know what you end up building, if that makes sense. You end up building sort of a master of nothing. And so I think probably the biggest lesson repeatedly that I've learned in the last 20 years is, if somebody asks for a bell or a whistle or a feature in a software product, really challenge them on, well, why are you asking for that? And is there a better way of doing it? Or is there another way that's already, you can already use within the product? So, defaulting to no, or it's okay to at least start at no and then move to a yes, such that the vision of what it is you're building continues to be as straight or sort of in as straight line as possible. Now you asked, I think the second part of your question was, okay, where have some of our products fallen short? I think I mentioned the basis product, which was an AI planning assistant, and again, from a technical and software technology perspective, it was brilliant. It was absolutely fantastic, but it was definitely a very large leap for the industry to absorb and consume, because there was a leap of faith involved in that product, whereby users had to start trusting the computer. It was interesting in that our previous solutions required a human or humans to feed information into the computer. So typically through a mouse or a keyboard, the user would enter information into the computer would do a little calculation and then provide an answer back. Well, with the AI tool, it was the first time where actually we sort of turned it on its head, where the computer was driving that interaction and that relationship. The computer would reach out to the human and give guidance. And that actually was quite unnerving for many of our early adopters. And so I think with hindsight, we should have done a better job of almost making the computer a little bit more humble in its suggestions.
Yeah.
So that was really sort of a bleeding edge versus a cutting edge lesson learned, I think, on that one. Again, nothing to do with the software. The software was fantastic. It was more of an adoption challenge. So it was more of a soft factor than a technical factor.
Excellent. No, that's really interesting, Dan. I think touch on a couple of things that you mentioned earlier about the software default to no. I think that's a really good piece of advice just for all walks of life, trying to be all things to all people, especially as a risk professional isn't advantageous by any means. Just another question I had. So something that you mentioned earlier in terms of lesson learned, when you said, I guess you would call it market research, when you were sort of reaching out to these, like you say, these evangelists, risk specialists for feedback. Is that something that you reined in a little bit as you've gone through more products and more software, and you've sort of reached out a little bit more to not necessarily these specialist jargon loving risk specialists, if that makes sense?
It does. So it's a tough balance because, obviously experts, whatever their field, you want to try and garner and foster that expertise and use that in the solution that you're building. But at the same time, I've never really believed in building something for just a niche audience.
Yeah,
For
of
me,
course.
if we can broaden the goodness of forecasting and planning, job well done. So I think it's a happy medium. I would say that over the years, some of those very, very high end domain experts, again, this is a human factor, not a technical factor, sometimes like to hide behind the complexity of their specialist subject, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And again, we've always tried to break down those barriers because at the end of the day, nothing is really that complicated. Nothing is I've always had the belief that everything is fixable and you can model anything with mathematics if you try hard enough. It's really not that difficult. And so, I think leveraging expertise is hugely valuable, but testing and validating that expertise that you've then modeled in a computer package with, you call it the layperson, with really the bigger audience that are going to use your solution, I think is actually more valuable.
That's really interesting, and I think that must be quite a difficult happy medium to balance, especially in the early stages. But no, that's really interesting. Thanks, Dan. So just moving on to artificial intelligence, then I know we've touched on it a couple of times there. So as luck would have it, one of the first episodes in season one, I'm not sure if anyone listening has had the opportunity to listen, was with a couple of gentlemen called Deepak Mistry and Richard Bendall Jones. And that was all around data and analytics and its relationship with risk management. And we explored sort of a number of themes, including how this innovative tech is going to massively increase our productivity, like the seamless integration of risk management into the tools that project practitioners use. And there was also some, albeit tongue-in-cheek, themes we explored as potential concerns that the industry might have about artificial intelligence sort of replacing risk managers, or at least partly making our roles obsolete. So in your opinion, Dan, apologies, that was slightly long-winded question, but what do you see the impact of AI in this space and in our profession? And do you think there's any weight to any of the things that I mentioned earlier?
Okay, so let's just briefly touch on sort of my humble take on the definition of AI. So I actually look at artificial intelligence as more augmented intelligence. So you can still use the AI acronym using my thinking. If AI is a computer's ability to emulate human thought process and draw inference, things like that, then I really do look at it as augmented rather than artificial, because it's not artificial because it's real.
Yeah.
And it's augmenting human expertise. Now, in the world of project management, scheduling, risk management, I think one of the hardest challenges for a human is mining through vast quantities of data. And it's even harder in the world of scheduling in that there isn't a standard definition or format for modeling stuff. And what I mean by that, in the most simplistic terms, if I'm looking at a construction project and I have engineering, procurement, construction stuff in sequence, I may go to another organization where engineering is called design, procurement is called purchasing, and construction is called execution. Now, as a human, I'm able to very quickly do that pattern matching and cross the chasm between design is actually analogous to engineering. Getting a computer to infer the fact that those two definitions or those two disciplines or domains are really the same thing is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But having said that, with the advent of or the evolution of AI in recent years, I think we're getting very close to where computers can actually make or draw useful comparisons in this world of non-structured data. Okay, so how's that going to help us in the world of risk management? Again, I think anything we can do to look at or to leverage historical patterns to help predict the future has to be, without question, valuable.
Yeah.
And again, as a human expert, I can look back and recall previous projects I've worked on and say, well, on a project 5 years ago, these were the top 5 risks. I think we should consider those in our project. Well, as time goes on and projects are obviously very, very complex, it's quite hard for humans to draw upon that historical information in an efficient manner. While computers are really good at tasks that humans find tedious. Yeah. So let's leverage the computer through this augmented intelligence technique for mining that historical information, looking at patterns, and coming back with, whether it's suggestions for benchmarks or recommendations with regards to risks or even opportunities that should be considered. So I am all in favor of AI or augmented intelligence to assist our industry. I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the technical solutions today that are almost looking for a problem to solve with AI. I think that's very backwards. I think our focus should still be on de-risking capital investments and improving forecasting. But let's use AI in a useful manner. And I think we're still trying to figure that. I think we're absolutely still trying to figure that out.
Do you feel like we're far away from the answer to that question? Because, like I say, I know in the podcast I mentioned previously, it was very much geared towards like the computer can almost save the project professional, the risk professional, a huge amount of time in, like you say, in cleansing, and not necessarily cleansing, but going through all this data. And yeah, so I'd be interested to hear just how close you think we are to that sort of benefit.
I think we're already there. We're just grappling with this incredibly powerful utility that we're not quite sure what to do with yet. Yes. And so I need to be a little bit careful here, because, and I'm going to say this with a smile, because we're actually working on a very exciting new venture to further improve the science of scheduling. And so, I look at CPM scheduling, and historically, this calculation has helped us determine what we call the critical path or near critical paths through a schedule. So yeah. If I said to you, okay, there's 10,000 activities in my schedule, and Microsoft Project is showing you that this is the critical path. Is that interesting to you? And in some ways, yes, but I think I've come to the realization in recent years, it's sort of interesting but irrelevant, because wouldn't you, as a domain expert, then look at that critical path and go, well, how achievable is the path? Do we have sufficient resources? Are there bottlenecks on that critical path? The critical path is just a path with no float.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that it's that useful. I think the real value and insight is, okay, let's analyze the characteristics of that either single critical path or multiple near critical paths. And let's look at, what are the factors that are going to challenge our ability to execute those paths. And for me, that's really exciting, because to date, we as human experts have applied our knowledge and experience to then look at those focused paths. Well, again, if a computer could assist in determining those characteristics, it's almost like a DNA analysis, then that's going to be such a massive step forward for us as an industry. Because again, computers are great at mining huge volumes of unstructured or historically structured, but now unstructured data. If by mining that information, we can get a much better sense of the characteristics of those driving paths, then that gives us a much better fighting chance of de-risking them. So it's indirectly tied to risk analysis.
Yeah.
So I think we're already there. That was a very long-winded way of saying we're there. I think it's probably analogous to the early 2000s with internet technology. There was a huge rush to bring web-based products to market, moving away from traditional Windows thick client applications. There were no standards, protocols. Security was pretty minimal. So I think we're in the Wild West phase is how I see it right now. But we're definitely in it. We're not it's not something in the future. It's here. I just think there's a lot of normalization to be done.
Amazing. No, I said this in previous episodes that it'd be interesting to come. I'm only 27 now, so I've still got a long stint left in the profession. But come back to these sort of episodes in a couple of decades and see where we're at compared to where we were when we were having these conversations. It'd be fascinating to see. But yeah, just moving on, Dan. So given how far the technology has come then in the past decade, at least, why does project success, in inverted commas, in your opinion, continue to have such a poor track record? I mean, is this a reflection of the lack of inroads in the software, or are we not using it to its maximum potential, or do you think it's indicative of unreasonably optimistic project scope?
It's probably a little bit of all of the above, as you just described. I think we've made great strides in improving the science of planning and forecasting, but we haven't solved it. And so I think there's still a lot more to be done. You could argue that this isn't a challenge that can just be resolved and then we're finished. Maybe it's sort of one of those things where we get incrementally better, we get closer and closer, but we never get there. And I think that's okay as well. There's this concept that I've been noodling on. That's, I guess, it's sort of execution resilience. If we think of what we've done to date in the world of planning and scheduling, we've made, like I said, we've made great inroads. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you can predict in the future. Now, during execution, there's inevitably going to be external factors that either jeopardize or in some cases improve our execution performance. And so, this concept of execution resilience, how resistant is our forecast to falling over due to changes in execution? And I think there's a lot of work still to be done there. No one's really looked at sensitivity of our forecast in execution. I think the other thing is, you pick up a project management textbook and almost without exception, the introductory paragraph talks about plan the work, then work the plan. Well, I think it's rubbish. I think it's just plain wrong, because it's not sequential, because even in execution, you should be replanning all the way through to final completion. So, I think the boundary between planning and execution should be eliminated, and I think planning should be seen as something that's carried out and should be carried out throughout the whole project life cycle.
Fascinating. No, that's really interesting. Thanks, Dan. And amazing. So lastly then, Dan, and I know this is probably quite a broad one, but just to answer the title of the episode, what is next? Where do you see the risk industry going? And I know we've probably touched on this throughout the episode, but I guess we can use this as a nice little sounding piece to conclude and wrap it up nicely.
Gosh, so you want me to forecast the future of the science of forecasting the future?
I do indeed. Good luck.
All right. Well, again, I think there's not going to be some magical, monumental stair-step improvement. I think it's all about incremental steps forward. I think to date, our approaches, while they've been sound and fairly well proven, have relied very heavily on mathematical techniques. A traditional risk analysis uses, a Monte Carlo simulation, which is sort of a brute force effort to just generate lots and lots of scenarios, looking at various inputs and then looking at the distribution of those outputs. I think that's valuable. I think where we're moving towards, though, we're really moving away from these models being all about data and more towards knowledge. And for me, the difference between data and knowledge is understanding. Data is just a set of numbers. P75 in a schedule is a data. Having knowledge around that P75 as to what's driving it, how can we improve upon it, things like that. So I think it's almost as if we're moving more towards the softer things in our space, the human expertise, or digitizing that human expertise, and blending that with what has been to date sort of largely an algorithmic approach to risk. And I think that's a good thing, because again, at the end of the day, humans, when presented with a number, typically then the next question is, well, where did that number come from? Is it defendable? Why is that number the number that it is? And the tools haven't got there yet. Today, the tools just say, hey, your P75 is such and such, and these are the top 7 risks. Adding that layer of understanding context, I think is going to be much more valuable, because it's going to help then the project team defend the risk-adjusted forecasts that they come up with. I think also, the more we can learn from prior projects, sort of like almost like a feedback loop, Pat, where moving away from almost arbitrarily plugging in values into a risk model to run the simulation or the analysis, using historical information. Again, for me, it's feeding knowledge into a model versus just raw numbers or data, because then that drives understanding on the output side.
No, exactly. I think in my early learning around risk modeling and what makes a good risk modeler, it was all very much been drilled into me. Context is king. You could teach a monkey how to press the buttons and spit a model out and then give it to a client, but it's actually understanding the context, being able to break that down and translate that in a way that's actually understandable is what's been drilled into me. That's the difference between somebody who cranks the handle and someone who's a genuine risk modeler who looks to get genuine value out of it.
Yeah, I think I think you nailed it. I think it's understanding of context beyond just a mathematical model.
Exactly. Brilliant. Well, Dan, thanks so much for all your brilliant thoughts and words of wisdom. I'm going to introduce something now that I've not done on any of the other podcasts, but I think it'd be good to start doing. I don't want it to be as a matter of fact as just doing all the topic and then jumping off. So yeah, I'd be really interested to know what you get up to when you're not building risk solutions. I know Arizona, there must be loads to do in Arizona. I'm pretty sure the Grand Canyon National Park's in Arizona, isn't it?
There are lots of things to do, and
hikes.
there's lots of hiking. Yes. Okay, so what do I do when I'm not sitting in front of a computer building software products?
Exactly right.
You're going to laugh. So I move away from sitting in front of a computer, and I go and sit in front of other computers. So what I love doing in my spare time, and I've been doing this for many years now, I collect and restore antique computers and very, very old machines. So actually all the way back to some of the early cryptography machines. So you're probably familiar with things like the German Enigma machine.
I'm indeed. Is that from the imitation game? Am I thinking of the right
correct?
game?
Yes. Yeah. And actually, because of those electromechanical machines like the Enigma machine, that actually accelerated the invention of the computer. The computer was actually developed to help crack the encryption algorithms that were used in those machines. And so I spend as much time as I can hunting down very often broken machines, and then spend time painstakingly restoring and bringing those machines back to life. So
absolutely love that. What do you do with the machines once they're restored? Do you keep hold of them, or do you move them on? Or
great question. A little of both. So to my wife's disgust, the majority of the machines end up in a computer museum that I curate. But unlike collecting stamps or coins, which are very, very small, these these machines are very large, very heavy, and also have to be situated in a climate-controlled environment as well. So
that's incredible. It's incredible. I love stuff like that. I'm the exact same. I've got some really eccentric, shall we say, extracurricular hobbies. But I'll save that for another episode. But amazing. Thanks so much, Dan. Just last couple of bits from me. So as I do with all my guests, I think it's a really good and really poignant part of the podcast for anybody listening, to myself, who's at the start of their career. If you could give yourself a piece of advice when you were at the start of your career that you know now that you didn't know then, what would that piece of advice be?
My goodness. Believe in what you believe, and don't worry about what others say, I think is, if I'd have been more confident in that statement 20 years ago, I think I probably would have been more successful. But I think, it's okay to have sleepless nights and worry about things. But again, if you believe in a solution, then everything's buildable, everything's fixable. And I think it's as simple as that.
Love that. Cheers, Dan. And then very last point. Sorry, if anybody off the back of the conversation we've had today wants to get in touch about anything, any of the solutions you've developed, or just anything we've talked about on the podcast, what would be the best way to get in touch?
Sure. So either hunt me down on LinkedIn, or my website is PM Focus. So pmprojectmanagementfocus.com, and you can easily contact me through that. So I would love to hear from anyone that's been listening today, and it'd be great to continue the discussions on a wonderful science of project scheduling.
Or if anybody wants to get in touch who also shares a similar passion in restoring old computers and machines, fire Dan a message. But no, Dan, thanks so much. And sorry, just on that, I'll put a link to Dan's website in the podcast notes as well. But Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you on. I really, really do appreciate you spending some time with us to talk about that today. So really do appreciate it, Dan. Thank you.
No, likewise, and apologies for the numerous interruptions from the family dog.
Oh, don't worry. I'm moving an hour in about whether to edit them out or not, but we'll see how we go. Cheers, Dan. Take it easy.
Good stuff. Thank you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.